It was in the summer of 2013 when I decided to do something I had always brushed off as a joke. I was 29 then, living in a flat in Oxfordshire. I worked as a freelance designer and had just come off a long, tiring project. I hadn't taken a proper break in over 6 months, and I could feel it in my bones. My sleep was terrible. I barely ate properly. I needed some kind of reset, something to shake me out of my own head. But instead of booking a peaceful cottage or heading to the coast, I got stuck on a stupid idea that had been floating around in the back of my mind for years. There was this old graveyard on the edge of the village I grew up in, North Lee. The place was quiet, surrounded by trees, cut off from the main road by a sloped patch of land and an iron gate that didn't even lock. My mates and I used to sneak in there when we were kids, not to vandalize or anything, just to spook each other. One of them had dared me, probably 15 years ago now, to spend the night alone in there. I never did it. Nobody did. But I always remembered the way he said it, grinning like it was nothing, and I always remembered how I laughed it off like it was beneath me. Now I was a grown man, living alone, sick of the screen and needing something stupid and simple. So I packed a small camping bag, bought a new roll mat and a basic tent, and made up my mind to do it. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, just myself. Just a night. Sleep in the corner of a silent old graveyard. Get up with the sun, head home, and have a laugh about it. I left my flat at around 5 in the afternoon, took the bus toward Whitney, and walked the last 2 miles into North Lee with the bag over my shoulder. I hadn't been back in years. The houses looked smaller, older. The corners I used to cut through as a teenager were blocked off or overgrown. There was a weird weight to the place. Not emotional, just unfamiliar, like stepping into a version of a film I'd already seen, only this time everyone was older and missing lines. The graveyard sat behind the remains of an old church that had been closed for decades. Stone arches still stood around the property, half swallowed by ivy and moss. The place hadn't been maintained in a long time. Most of the stones were leaning. Some were so weathered the names had faded completely. A few were cracked and had fallen sideways into the grass. Nature had nearly reclaimed the whole space. I reached it just after 7. The sky was still bright, but I could feel the air cooling down already. I walked the perimeter, making sure no one else was around. A few cars passed on the distant road, but other than that, it was dead quiet. I found a flat patch of ground in the far back corner where the trees formed a thick line along the edge. That felt safer, or maybe just a little more hidden. I laid out my gear: tent, bag, flashlight, water bottle. I even brought some snacks and an old camping knife, just in case I got spooked. The tent went up quickly. I wasn't new to camping. I'd done a few solo trips before in the peaks in Wales, but this was different. There's something about sleeping where people are buried that plays tricks with your sense of space. I kept glancing at the headstones. Some were only a few meters away, shadows stretching toward me as the sun dipped behind the trees. I didn't plan to go to sleep right away, so I sat outside the tent for a while with my back against one of the larger stones. I had my phone out, but there was no signal. That didn't surprise me. I wasn't trying to live stream the thing. I just listened to the wind in the branches and watched the sky shift into a mix of orange and violet. I remember thinking it felt peaceful. It really did. Not scary, not weird, just quiet in a way you never really get anymore. I munched on a granola bar and sipped water. There was a rabbit hopping in the grass on the far end. Birds settling in the branches. It was just a patch of land. That's all. But that feeling didn't last. At around 9, it started getting dark. Not just less light, but heavy dark. The kind that makes everything look flatter, like it's been drained of depth. I turned on my flashlight, not wanting to waste my phone battery. The beam cut across the grass and lit up the damp stones in front of me. I heard a rustle behind the trees and froze, but it was just a breeze shaking the leaves. I wasn't nervous, Not yet. I zipped up the tent, crawled inside, and wrapped myself in the bag. I left the flashlight beside me, still on. The fabric glowed a bit from the inside, pale and warm. I laid there for maybe an hour, trying to sleep. I rolled onto my side, closed my eyes, slowed my breathing, but I couldn't drift off. The silence was too complete. Every little shift, grass settling, twigs snapping, my own heartbeat, felt too loud. Around 10:30, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything I saw or heard. It was just a change in atmosphere, the kind of pressure that creeps in just before a storm, even when the air is still. My skin prickled. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent halfway, and peered out. There was nothing, just the same stones, the same crooked trees, the same grass. I held still for a full minute, breathing shallow. Then I heard something, not far, maybe 15, 20 meters away, a dragging sound, like someone pulling a sack or something heavy through the grass. I froze. My hand went to the knife I'd left next to the flashlight. The dragging stopped. I didn't dare breathe too loud. I killed the flashlight, pulled the flap of the tent closed, and waited. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Only now it was closer and slower. It was real, not my head. Something was out there. Someone, maybe a poacher, maybe some sick guy playing a joke. I reached slowly into my bag for my phone, but the signal was still dead. I didn't know what to do. I sat there, heart pounding, holding the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, afraid to move. Then I heard footsteps, soft ones, grass under slow boots, a human rhythm but not confident, not fast. It circled the tent maybe 3 meters out. Once, then again. I gripped the knife tighter. I wanted to yell. I wanted to say something, but I remembered the rules. If someone's messing with you, don't show fear. But if someone isn't messing with you, if they're seriously dangerous, then silence is the only edge you have. The footsteps stopped at the back of the tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. For what felt like 10 whole minutes, there was nothing. Then a sharp click, not like a branch snapping, like a camera shutter, just once. And then the footsteps walked away. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink for a long time. I sat there, knife in hand, eyes wide in the dark, every muscle tensed. I didn't hear anything else for hours. No more dragging, no more footsteps, not even animals. At around 4 in the morning, I finally unzipped the tent again and looked outside. The horizon was just starting to pale. The headstones stood where they had before. There were no signs of movement, but something had been there. I packed up quietly. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I rolled the tent into a tight ball and shoved everything into the bag as fast as I could. I checked the spot where I'd heard the dragging. The grass was pressed down in a long line. Something had definitely moved there, but there was no blood. No signs of anything dropped. Just a single square piece of black tape stuck to the base of a gravestone. I peeled it off. There was nothing under it. No message.
No symbol.
Just tape. I left the graveyard without looking back. Took me 2 hours to walk to the main road and catch the bus. When I got back to my flat, I shut every curtain and locked every door. I sat on the floor of my living room and stared at the flashlight, still faintly glowing in my bag. The next day, I returned to check the camera feeds from nearby traffic lights. I knew it was pointless. There was nothing facing the graveyard, but it made me feel like I was doing something. I called the local council, asked if anyone had reported anything strange in the area. They said no. That same evening, I went to the bathroom cabinet and pulled out the travel-size mirror I kept for shaving. And I found it, stuck to the back black tape, the same kind, folded neatly on the edge, as if someone had been inside. I moved out of that flat a month later, never camped again, never went back to North Lee. I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't a ghost. It was a person, someone alive, someone who knew I was coming, someone who waited for the dark. And the worst part, they didn't try to hurt me, they just watched, and that's so much worse. I was 33 that summer. It was late July of 2016, and the heat had been hanging in the air for days. I had been living in Kansas City for most of the year, working a desk job that left me drained at the end of each day. Watching my health and sanity were down by office lights and recycled air. I needed a break. I needed something simple, something outside. I used to camp a lot when I was younger, especially when I was living out west. I had some gear stored in plastic bins, mostly collecting dust. I hadn't touched them in over 5 years. But on that Friday morning, I loaded everything into the back of my truck. I picked a spot I hadn't been before, Mark Twain National Forest, just into Missouri, far enough south to feel away from the city, but close enough to drive in a few hours. I picked a remote section of it, somewhere near 11 Point River. I planned to spend 3 nights out there alone, off the grid, away from people and far from cell towers. I didn't tell many people, just left a text for my brother with a rough location in case anything happened. The drive down was long and quiet, mostly back roads after the first hour. By the time I reached the small Forest Service road that would take me to my trailhead, the sun was low and the shadows were stretching out across the hills. I parked on a gravel patch beside an old wooden sign with faded paint that simply read, Mill Ridge Access. I threw on my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. I planned to set up camp about 4 miles near a bend in a stream that I saw on the topo map. The trail was barely maintained, just a narrow path between thick trees, mostly oak and hickory. I kept a slow pace, watching for snakes and deadfall. The woods felt still, too still. I kept expecting to hear cicadas or the call of some bird, but there was almost nothing. It wasn't silent exactly, but it was thin, the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched. After 2 hours, I reached the creek. It was smaller than I expected, more like a trickle over rocks, but it was enough. I found a flat patch of ground uphill from the water and set up my tent. Nothing fancy, just a small one-man dome tent with enough space to lie down and keep my gear dry. I laid out my sleeping pad, set up my camp stove, and got dinner going, some freeze-dried beef stew I ate out of the bag. By the time I finished eating, dusk was falling fast. I cleaned up, hung my food in a bag from a nearby tree, and sat down on a log to let the dark settle around me. I didn't build a fire that night. It was too hot and I didn't want to deal with gathering wood. Plus, something about the place didn't make me feel like being too visible. I sat for a while, listening to the woods. Somewhere off to the east, I heard a barred owl. That was the only normal sound I'd heard all day. I took it as a good sign. I went into my tent, zipped up the flap, and stretched out. I fell asleep quicker than I thought I would. I woke up just after 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, more like a series of soft, deliberate steps through dry leaves. I lay there perfectly still. My heart thudded up into my throat. The sound was maybe 30 feet away, just past the edge of my camp. Not heavy, not rushed, just methodical. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but deer don't move like that, not in that pattern. These weren't bounding steps or nervous scuffles. They were slow, purposeful, human. I stayed in my tent, frozen. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I just listened. For about 30 seconds, the steps moved around the edge of my camp, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't hear walking away. I didn't hear anything. I didn't move for nearly an hour. Eventually, my eyelids got heavy again. I drifted in and out of sleep until dawn. When the light finally started creeping in through the tent walls, I sat up and unzipped the flap. The clearing looked untouched. I stepped out barefoot and checked around. Nothing. No trash disturbed. No food bag pulled down. No visible tracks in the dry dirt. I told myself it must have been an animal. A raccoon maybe. Maybe a possum. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder all morning. I made breakfast and then packed a small day pack to hike further upriver. I wanted to explore, get away from that eerie feeling. I figured movement would calm me down. The trail followed the water for a while before climbing up into a rocky ridge. The views were decent. I didn't see anyone all morning. Around midday, I sat on a boulder overlooking the trees and ate a protein bar. I stayed out longer than I planned. When I got back to camp around 4, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A rock, one that hadn't been there before. It was sitting right in front of my tent door. Small, gray, smooth, like it had been picked from a creek bed. I hadn't seen any rocks like that around my campsite. I bent down and picked it up. It was cool to the touch. I stood there for a long minute, looking into the trees. Someone had been here while I was gone. I walked a wide circle around my camp, looking for prints, broken branches, anything. But the forest was dry and covered in leaf litter. There were no clear signs. I stayed close that evening. I sharpened a stick, half as a joke to myself and half for comfort. I didn't cook that night, just ate a cold meal and kept my back to a tree. The sun dipped behind the hills and the darkness poured in. That night I didn't sleep. I lay inside my tent with the stick next to me and my flashlight in hand, just listening. Every sound made my heart race. A twig snapping, a distant rustle. None of it let me rest. Around 3 a.m. I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, slower. I held my breath. The steps came from the direction of the creek and stopped right at the edge of my camp. I could barely breathe. Then I heard something much worse. The unmistakable sound of my food bag being pulled down. It was hanging 12 feet off the ground, tied off a branch I had picked the day before. Someone was up in that tree. I shot up, unzipped the tent, and jumped out with the flashlight. I shined it toward the tree. Nothing. The bag was still there, still swinging. But now I could hear someone moving fast into the trees, crashing through the brush. Gone in seconds. I didn't sleep after that. I sat outside, stick in hand, flashlight on until sunrise. I told myself I would leave that morning, but when the sun rose and nothing else happened, I convinced myself again that it was probably nothing. Probably kids. Probably some hunter messing around. I didn't want to believe anything worse. That day, I packed everything except the tent. I kept my gear tight. I planned to hike out the next morning. I didn't want to do it at night. I made some instant coffee and kept the day slow. Every hour that passed made me feel a little more foolish for being scared. But when the sun started to go down, I felt that pressure again. Like the forest itself was pushing in tighter. Around 8 p.m. I heard it. A sound that still makes my stomach knot when I think about it. A whistle. One short burst. Sharp. Deliberate. Then silence. It came from the same direction the steps had come the night before. Same direction as the creek. I didn't move. I didn't even look. I stayed seated with my back to a tree, my gear packed tight beside me. I held my flashlight in one hand, my stick in the other, and stared into the dark. 30 minutes later, I heard another sound, this one softer, a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It lasted only a few seconds, but I felt the blood drain from my face. I didn't sleep. The sounds didn't come back that night, but I sat awake until the sky turned gray. As soon as there was enough light to see, I broke down the tent, stuffed it into my pack, and left. I didn't eat. I didn't stop. I kept moving fast along the trail, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. When I got back to my truck, I saw something that made my hands shake. Another rock. Same size, same smooth texture, sitting on the hood of my truck. There was no mistaking it now. Someone had followed me, watched me, walked through my camp while I slept, climbed into the trees, left things behind, and they had been close enough to touch my vehicle while I was out in the woods. I unlocked the door, threw my gear in the back, and got in. I didn't look around. I didn't try to find anyone. I just started the engine and drove. Didn't stop until I was back on the highway. I didn't go camping again after that. Not alone. Not in a forest that quiet. I kept that rock. It sits on my desk, next to a compass I used to carry. I don't keep it as a trophy. I keep it as a reminder that no matter how deep into the woods you go, you're never truly alone. And sometimes it's not animals you need to worry about. Sometimes it's the people who don't want to be found. The ones who know the forest better than you ever will. The ones who don't make a sound when they walk. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 34. I remember the exact month, late July, because it had been a brutal summer. I'd been working construction on a new housing site south of Salt Lake City, Utah. My boss had been riding me hard, and my back felt like it was made of rebar. I needed time to clear my head. I wasn't married. No kids. I lived alone in a basement flat and mostly kept to myself. That Friday, I left work early, told the guys I was heading off into the hills for the weekend. Just me, the mountains, and no noise but the wind and whatever I could make with my boots and breath. I liked going solo, especially into places that didn't draw weekend hikers or screaming kids. I wanted the kind of quiet that wasn't easy to find anymore. A few years back, I'd stumbled across a place about 2 hours east called Red Hollow. It was technically part of a private ranch that bordered a stretch of dense forest that nobody really paid attention to. There weren't any posted signs, and the few trails there were long overgrown. The land dipped in strange ways, like it had been folded once and never smoothed back out. Even locals didn't talk about it much. I only found out about it from a guy I worked with who said his uncle used to go hunting up there in the 80s. I packed light. One-man tent, bedroll, dry food, a lighter, my headlamp, my knife, a small hatchet, and my .22 rifle, which I kept slung across my back more for show than anything else. I wasn't planning to hunt, just felt better having it. The drive out was long and mostly uneventful. By late afternoon, I was parking my truck at the edge of an unmarked turnoff, a place where the dirt path turned to thick brush. You'd miss it unless you already knew it was there. The hike in took about an hour. I followed what used to be a game trail, barely visible anymore. Trees leaned in close on both sides. The farther I went, the quieter it got. No road noise, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on dead leaves and the soft buzz of insects. I reached my usual spot just as the sun was starting to drop behind the hills. It was a flat clearing surrounded by tall pines with a small slope leading down to a dry creek bed. The earth there was soft and covered in pine needles. I set up my tent, gathered a ring of stones for a fire pit, and got a small flame going with some dry branches I snapped from nearby deadfall. That first night passed like any other. I cooked a few slices of sausage over the fire, sipped water from my canteen, and lay back watching the sky. It was one of those nights where the stars come out so thick you feel like you're under glass. I felt peace that I hadn't felt in months. Slept like a stone until just before dawn when the cold woke me up. I got up, added a few sticks to the fire, and walked off to relieve myself. That's when I noticed it. Tracks. I stood there, halfway through zipping up my pants, just staring at the ground about 20 feet from my tent. The soil was soft, and there was a clean set of prints that hadn't been there the day before. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't from any animal I could place. They were too long, almost human, but the toes were wrong, too narrow, sharp, like someone had tried to draw them by memory. I crouched down, touched one with my fingertips. The edges were fresh, no leaf litter in them. They were made sometime in the night. I stood up slowly and looked around. Trees stood still and quiet. I didn't hear anything. No birdsong, which was odd. Normally, the woods come alive just before sunrise. This morning was dead silent. I tried to shake it off. Maybe some local animal I didn't recognize. Maybe even a trick of erosion or shadows. Still, I couldn't relax. I walked a slow circle around my camp, scanning the ground, looking for more tracks, but those were the only ones. Later that morning, I decided to hike a few miles further east to a rocky outcrop that gave a decent view over the tree line. I'd done the walk before and knew the terrain, but the farther I went, the more I started to notice things that made my skin itch. I kept seeing broken branches about chest high. Not random either, always clean breaks, fresh. Pine needles scattered below, but no trees nearby looked wind damaged. And then there were these odd patches of grass that had been pressed flat, as if someone had been lying there, completely still. I stopped once to take a sip from my water bottle and felt something behind me. Not heard, felt, like the weight of eyes pressing down from behind. I turned fast, scanned the trees. Nothing, just those dark trunks and shadows. The rest of the day dragged. I didn't enjoy the hike like I thought I would. I felt watched the entire time. When I got back to my tent, the fire ring was still intact, but something was off. The tent had been moved. It hadn't been dragged far, just rotated maybe 30 degrees. But I could tell because I'd set it facing a particular pine tree that had a long white scar along the bark. Now it was facing a deadfall log. I stood there staring at it, trying to convince myself I was wrong, but I knew I wasn't. I hadn't staked the tent because the ground was soft, so it could have been shifted by wind. But there was no wind that day. I ate a cold dinner that night and skipped the fire. I just wanted to crawl into my sleeping bag and forget it all. But sleep didn't come. I kept hearing soft sounds just outside the tent, like someone placing their feet carefully, deliberately on the pine needles. Not walking, just shifting their weight. Then nothing. Then a crunch. Then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deep. I gripped the handle of my knife and stared up at the nylon roof of my tent, waiting for the zipper to open, for a hand to reach in. It never came. Morning finally bled in slow and gray. I waited until the light was full before crawling out. The camp looked undisturbed. No footprints. Nothing touched. The fire pit was cold, untouched since I left it. Still, I'd had enough. I packed up fast and didn't eat, just wanted out. As I was rolling up the bedroll, I glanced up the hill and saw something. At first, I thought it was a tree, just a dark shape between two pines. But it was too narrow, too tall, and it wasn't there before. Stood completely still, not swaying, not shifting, just watching. I didn't move. I blinked hard, and it was gone. I've seen things in the woods before. Elk, coyotes, even a mountain lion once from a distance. This wasn't any of those. It was too tall to be a man, but not thick enough to be an animal. And the way it vanished, it didn't duck or walk. It was just there 1 second and gone the next. I left everything I didn't need and started walking. Fast. My rifle was slung across my chest now, safety off. The trail back seemed longer, twisted in ways it hadn't before. The trees felt closer, the air heavier. About halfway back to the truck, I found more tracks. The same ones from the morning before. Long, narrow, too clean. They paralleled mine for about 20 feet before veering off toward the deeper woods. That was when I heard the mimic. It was the first sound I'd heard in hours. It was my voice, calling my name, but it wasn't right. Too flat, too perfect, like a recording being played back. Same tone, same rhythm, but cold. Empty. I ran. I don't remember how I didn't trip. I didn't look back, just focused on my boots, the trail, and the sound of my own breathing. When I finally burst out of the trees into the clearing where I'd parked, I half expected the truck to be gone. But it was there, waiting. I didn't stop to look behind me, slammed the gear into reverse and tore down that rough dirt path, nearly wrecked twice on the way back to the main road. I never told anyone about it. I kept quiet for a long time, but I've never gone camping alone since. I sold the rifle a year later, couldn't even look at it. The worst part isn't what I saw, it's what I think I saw. Something that shouldn't be able to move the way it did. Something that could watch, listen, and learn. Something that wanted me to know it was there. It didn't come at me. It didn't need to. It knew fear would do the work. I think about those tracks sometimes, how perfect they were, like something walking through the world pretending to be something it wasn't. Not a ghost, not a monster from a fairy tale, just something old, smart, and patient. And I think it wanted me to come back. Not that weekend, but someday, alone, like I always was. I never will. I never liked camping much, but in the summer of 2017, after a rough year and some pressure from a coworker who lent me a tent and gear, I finally gave it a try. I was 34 back then, living alone in a small rented flat in Exeter. I worked maintenance at a college nearby. My girlfriend had broken things off the winter before, and I'd been in a sort of rut ever since. I thought getting out of the city and into some open space might help, even just for a couple of days. I picked a spot not too far out, Dartmoor. Not one of the official campsites, though. I looked around online and found some mentions of wild camping near a place called Fernworthy Forest, where people sometimes pitch tents for the night if they stayed discreet. I figured I'd hike into the woods a bit, find a quiet patch to myself, and just try to disconnect for a while. I packed light: tent, sleeping bag, a couple of torches, a knife, 2 days worth of food, water, and a small stove for heating cans. I brought a paperback book, too. I planned to get there late morning, set up, and then just walk and relax. Nothing complicated. The day I left, it was warm but overcast, the kind of gray that hangs low without quite turning into rain. I took the bus to Chagford and hiked out the rest of the way, following one of the smaller trails until I was about half a mile from the road, deep enough to not see or hear anything but trees and wind. I found a clearing near a small stream, just large enough for one tent and space to sit and cook. No signs of recent visitors. It was perfect. I got the tent up around 1 p.m., made myself some instant noodles, and then walked around for a couple of hours with no aim, following deer trails and listening to the birds. I wasn't thinking about anything, which felt good. I didn't see anyone the whole time. Just trees, mud, bracken, and old stone walls half swallowed by the woods. I came back around 5 p.m. and sat by the tent with a tin of beans and read my book until the light started to fade. That first night, nothing happened. It was quiet. A few odd noises in the undergrowth here and there, probably foxes or rabbits. It got colder than I expected, but I'd brought enough to stay warm. I remember drifting off listening to the wind rubbing branches together. I woke up once in the night needing to pee. I stepped outside and did my business a few feet from the tent, torch in hand, and saw nothing strange. Just black woods and the sound of the stream trickling by. I zipped back into the tent, fell asleep again, and woke with the sun around 6. I made tea, had a cereal bar, and went for another walk. The woods were thicker in this part, and the trails didn't go far. Around 9 a.m., I heard the first sound of a person nearby. It was faint, almost like a branch snapping on purpose. Not a bird. It came from the direction of the trail I'd used to enter the forest. I stopped and listened. A few more seconds of silence, then another quiet crunch. I figured someone else was out here hiking and didn't think much of it. I walked back toward the tent slowly, staying aware, mostly out of instinct. I hadn't seen anyone in over 24 hours, but Dartmoor wasn't empty. People passed through. Hikers, runners, campers. It wasn't strange. I got back to the tent and saw nothing unusual. I ate, read a bit more, and decided to stay one more night. I'd planned for 2. I didn't want to pack up early just because someone else was around. That afternoon, I went off-trail deeper into the forest. It was slower, going thick roots and soggy patches, but peaceful. I found a stone outcropping with moss and sat there for a while. Around 4 p.m., I turned back. The way back took longer, and when I reached the tent, I noticed something small that gave me pause. A twig, thin and bent, had been placed upright on top of my tent, balanced like someone had snapped it to the right length and stuck it there. It wasn't mine. I stood looking at it for a while. It wasn't a natural fall. It had been placed deliberately. I hadn't touched it. I checked my bag, my gear, everything. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. Just that twig. Like someone had come through and wanted me to know they'd seen it. I left it there for a bit while I ate, but something about it unsettled me enough that before the sun went down, I broke it in half and tossed it into the undergrowth. That second night, I didn't sleep as well. The wind picked up, and every time something scraped or rustled, I woke up. Around midnight, I swear I heard footsteps near the tent. Slow, deliberate, crunch, crunch, pause. Not animals. I lay frozen, holding my torch, heart hammering. I didn't shine the light right away. I just waited. The steps circled the tent once, maybe twice. Then they stopped. I lay there not breathing, trying to tell myself it could be a deer or something similar. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nothing. I turned on the torch and unzipped the flap an inch. Shined it outside. Empty. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed zipped up with the knife in my hand. Nothing more happened, but I was done. I planned to pack at first light. When dawn came, I stepped outside and saw a footprint in the soft ground between the tent and the stream. It wasn't mine. My boots had a different sole. This one was thinner, longer. Someone had stood there right near my tent during the night. I packade fast. I didn't even boil water, just stuffed everything back into my rucksack and hit the trail. I moved quick, not even looking back. The woods were dead silent. No birds, no breeze. I'd been walking maybe 10 minutes when I heard something behind me. Not close, maybe 50 or 60 feet back. A low, heavy rustling, like someone following but not trying to be silent anymore. I didn't run. I don't know why. Maybe because I was afraid running would make it worse. I just kept walking, faster, pushing my way back to the open path. Eventually, I reached the tree line near the road, and the noise stopped. I looked back. There, half hidden behind a tree maybe 20 meters away, I saw him. A man. He was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes, hooded maybe, or long hair. I couldn't make out his face. He stood half concealed, not moving, just watching. I stared for maybe 3 seconds. Then I turned and kept walking. I didn't run, but I moved steady, not looking back again. I didn't stop until I reached the bus stop in Chagford. I sat on the bench for an hour before the bus came. While I waited, I kept checking behind me, sure I'd see him again, but no one came. I got home, locked the door, and stayed inside the rest of the weekend. That night, I slept with the lights on. A few days later, I looked up news from that area. Nothing reported. No missing people, no strange sightings. Just another patch of forest on the edge of Dartmoor. I never went camping again after that. There was nothing supernatural about it. Just a man out in the woods who knew I was alone. I think about it sometimes. The twig on the tent, the steps, the footprint, the way he stood there half behind the tree not doing anything, just watching. There was nothing stopping him from coming closer. He just didn't want to, not yet. That's what bothers me the most. It was the summer of 2013. I was 27 then, working as a freelance mechanic in a small town just outside Newcastle, in northern England. Work was slow that month, and I'd been feeling a little trapped in the routine. I hadn't had a real break in years, so I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time: go camping. Alone. I packed up my old Volkswagen van with basic supplies: tent, sleeping bag, torch, some cans of food, a water jug, extra clothes, a gas burner, and a folding chair. I didn't tell many people, just left a note with my sister saying I'd be gone for a few days, heading north towards the Cheviot Hills near the border with Scotland. I'd been up there once as a teenager on a school hike. Quiet, remote, and filled with long, empty trails. By the time I left town, it was late afternoon. The sky had that warm, lazy glow that only English summers can bring. I followed the winding roads through green hills and old stone villages, with no real plan other than to find a place to camp before dark. Around 7:30 p.m., I pulled off the main road onto a narrow dirt path I'd found on an old hiking forum. It led deep into a wooded area that was supposed to open into a small, flat clearing near a stream. The van struggled a bit with the uneven ground, but I finally made it to the spot. It was perfect, quiet, no one around for miles. I pitched my tent near the edge of the trees, just beyond where the woods opened into a clearing. The stream was maybe 40 yards away. The only sounds were birds, rustling leaves, and the steady trickle of water. I cooked a quick dinner of baked beans and bread on the small gas stove and ate while watching the sun dip behind the trees. The quiet was something I wasn't used to anymore. No cars, no people, no humming of machines. Just silence, deep and thick. That first night was peaceful. I sat out for a while in the folding chair, staring at the sky, listening to the distant owls. I felt at peace, but something woke me in the middle of the night. A sharp rustling, not like the wind. It was close, maybe just outside the tent. I stayed still, heart racing. Then silence again. It might have been a fox or badger, I told myself. I forced my eyes shut and waited for sleep to take me again. The next morning was calm. Sunlight came through the thin tent walls, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. I had a quick breakfast and went for a short walk along the stream. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or so, just enough to shake off the unease from the night before. I didn't see anyone, no hikers or even old boot prints. It was like I had the whole forest to myself. That afternoon, I read a book and did some sketching in my notebook. I used to draw a lot when I was younger but had stopped when life got busy. Felt good to do it again. Around 5 p.m., I gathered some wood and set up a small fire in a ring of stones. The evening rolled in slowly, painting the sky orange and pink. As I sat by the fire that second night, I got the feeling I wasn't alone. The kind of feeling where the hairs on your neck stand up. I scanned the trees, listened carefully, but nothing, just wind and branches. I stayed out by the fire longer than usual, adding more wood than I needed, just to keep the light going. Eventually, I turned in. I zipped up the tent, kept the torch nearby, and lay down fully dressed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time the wind moved, every snap of a twig, I felt myself tense up. At some point past midnight, I heard footsteps. Not an animal this time. These were heavy, slow, and deliberate. Someone walking through the brush. I sat up, barely breathing. The steps circled the tent once, maybe twice, then stopped. I didn't move. I stayed like that for over an hour, waiting. Nothing else happened. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion. I woke up early, just after sunrise. I stepped outside and checked the area. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I told myself maybe it had just been my imagination, fueled by isolation and the eerie quiet. Still, I packed up most of my gear that morning. I kept the tent standing but moved my essentials back to the van, just in case. I told myself I'd spend one more night. If anything weird happened again, I'd leave first thing in the morning. I spent the day exploring further along the stream. It was a peaceful walk until I found something odd, an old rusted kettle hanging from a branch. Nearby, a few broken planks were arranged into what looked like a seat. It wasn't recent, but it hadn't been there for decades either. Someone had camped here, maybe often. I felt watched the whole time. That heavy, uneasy feeling had come back. I didn't linger. I returned to camp, started a fire, and kept my pocket knife clipped to my belt. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat outside the tent by the fire, wrapped in my jacket, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and careful. Then a sound I'll never forget. The click of a lighter. Just one flick. Not mine. I turned the torch on and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam didn't reach far enough. I couldn't see anything, but the sound of quiet movement came from beyond the light. I backed toward the van slowly. I didn't run. I didn't want to make noise. I got in, locked the doors, and sat in the driver's seat, listening. I heard another flick of the lighter, then footsteps closer. I stayed perfectly still. Eventually, it went quiet. I don't know how long I waited, maybe 2 hours, before the sky began to lighten. I didn't bother checking the tent. I started the engine and drove out of there, branches scraping the sides of the van as I sped back to the main road. I didn't stop driving until I reached a petrol station near Alnwick. I washed my face in the bathroom sink, bought a coffee, and sat there in the car park for a long time. I looked at myself in the mirror, pale, eyes wide and bloodshot. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone lit a lighter near my tent? That I heard footsteps? That I felt watched? No one got hurt. Nothing was stolen. But I know what I felt. I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching. I never camped alone again after that. And I never went back to the Cheviot Hills. Even now, sometimes when I lie in bed in the dark, I remember that sound, the faint flick of a lighter out in the trees. And I wonder who was out there with me that night and why they never came closer. I was 31 that year. I had just finished a long contract job doing carpentry work down in Devon, and I needed a break from people, schedules, phone signals, the whole mess. I'd saved up a bit and decided to take a short camping trip by myself up north. The Lake District felt right. I'd been a few times, always with friends or girlfriends, but this time I just wanted quiet. Just me, my gear, and the kind of empty silence you only get in places like that. It was early October 2013. Weather was beginning to turn, and I knew I was pushing it by camping that late in the year. I didn't care. I liked the colder air, the way the trails emptied out once summer ended. I packed everything up in my van. Tent, food, water, boots, map, and headed for a lesser-known ridge just west of Ullswater. I don't want to say exactly where. People know the area for hiking, but there are places up there off the main routes, small patches of flat ground where no one goes unless they're lost or looking to be alone. It was late afternoon when I parked the van at a small levee beside a farm road. I checked the weather again on my phone. Rain was coming in overnight. Nothing major, just a constant drizzle according to the forecast. I didn't mind that. I brought a thick ground tarp, extra clothes, and even some whiskey to stay warm. The walk-in took about 2 hours. The ridge I was heading to wasn't high or dangerous, just far enough in that it felt cut off. The path wound through some patches of old pine, then opened up into a wide, uneven slope with scrubby grass and scattered rocks. I found a flat patch behind a windbreak of low shrubs, set up my tent, and boiled water for a dehydrated meal. Nothing special, just calories and warmth. I wasn't looking for comfort. By the time the light began to fade, I was already zipped up in my sleeping bag, jacket still on. The rain started a little after dark, a light tapping at first like fingers brushing the tent skin. I lay there listening to it, my headlamp turned off. No wind, no animals, just that soft patter of rain on nylon. I felt calm. I even drifted off for a while. Then I woke up again. Not to thunder or pain or anything big, just a small sound that didn't belong. I lay very still. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't wind either. It was something sharper, a small, irregular click sound, like stone on metal. At first, I told myself it was probably just a branch falling, or maybe the rain hitting a loose rock nearby. But it didn't stop. Came again. Click, click, click. Not steady, but with odd timing, like someone wasn't sure how loud they wanted to be. I stayed in my bag and listened. My heart had started beating a little faster. I wasn't panicking, not yet, just alert. I reached slowly into the side pocket of the tent and pulled out the small camping knife I kept with me. It was more of a tool than a weapon, but it made me feel a bit more grounded. The sound stopped. Just rain again. My ears strained. I heard nothing else for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. I must have stayed frozen in that position for most of it, knife still in hand, staring up at the dark ceiling of the tent. Eventually, I told myself it had just been my imagination, maybe an animal, maybe nothing at all. I turned on my side and let my breathing slow again. Rain still came down, a bit heavier now, but nothing too bad. I eventually dozed off. The next time I woke up, it was to a different kind of noise. It wasn't close. It wasn't sharp. It was muffled and slow, a long, wet, dragging sound. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something soft being pulled over wet earth. Not fast, not regular. Just steady. Drag. Pause. Drag again. It sounded like it came from the other side of the shrubs, maybe 20 feet away. I held my breath. Came again. Closer this time. My tent was zipped shut. The rain was steady now, and the wind had picked up just enough to make things confusing. Couldn't see out. I didn't dare turn on my headlamp. The dragging sound stopped for a while. I stayed absolutely still. I didn't even shift in my bag. Then I heard another sound. Not dragging. A softer, lighter noise. A pressing sound, almost like something stepping lightly in wet soil. Then silence.
No rain.
No wind. Just silence so deep I could hear my own blood moving in my ears. I don't know how long I stayed like that, gripping the knife so hard my fingers went numb. The next noise was what finally made me sit up. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp. It was quiet. A sort of sniffing sound, low to the ground, like someone smelling the edge of the tent. It moved slowly around the backside. Something was there. No animal I know of makes a sound like that. Not up in those hills. It was long and wet and slow. Not panicked like a badger or sharp like a fox. It was controlled, deliberate. I sat upright, barely breathing, my back against the cold tent fabric. I could feel the damp pushing through where my head touched the ceiling. The sniffing moved along one edge, then stopped. I could hear the light rustling of the rain again, barely there. I waited and waited. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the time the gray light of morning began to push in through the thin nylon, I was still in the exact same position. My knees ached. My hands were stiff. I finally dared to unzip the tent. Nothing. No signs of anyone. No footprints that I could see in the wet soil, though most of the ground was covered in short, tangled grass and slick rock. I walked around the tent slowly, looking for signs. I found one thing. About 10 feet from where I'd set up, tucked into the edge of the shrubs, there was a flat stone. And on top of that stone was a small, rusted screw, the kind you'd find in an old fence post or gate hinge. It hadn't been there the night before. I would have seen it. That day, I didn't pack up right away. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the screw was from something buried in the mud that washed up with the rain. Maybe someone was just walking nearby in the dark and didn't know I was there. Maybe, but I didn't buy it. I stayed one more night, though I set my tent up in a different spot, closer to a shallow rock face with some shelter behind it. The second night was calm.
No noises.
Just steady rain.
No dragging sounds. No sniffing.
I still didn't sleep. When I hiked back to the van the next morning, I passed no one. The roads were wet, empty. I drove south for 5 hours without stopping. I didn't camp again for the rest of the year. I never told anyone, really. Just figured it wasn't worth trying to explain. There's nothing glamorous about it, no ghost story or monster. Just the strange, sick feeling that someone was nearby. Someone that didn't want to be seen. Sometimes at night, even now, I think about that sound, the dragging, and the sniffing. Not loud, not fast. Just the kind of sound that tells you something is paying attention. And not in a good way. I reported nothing. I told no one. Nothing technically happened. But I've camped over 100 times in my life. Solo with friends all over the UK and Europe. And nothing before or after that trip has ever made me feel like that again. Not scared, watched. Whoever or whatever was out there that night didn't want to talk. They didn't want to be seen. They just wanted to listen, to smell, and maybe to wait. And that's worse than anything else. It was late summer in 2014 when I decided to take a long weekend off work and get away from everything. I'd been working a steady job as a welder in a small town near Swansea, Wales, and I'd been feeling burnt out. My back was sore, my eyes were strained, and all I wanted was some quiet. I didn't want to deal with anyone, didn't want to hear traffic or phones or coworkers talking about nothing. I just wanted trees, a tent, a fire, and silence. I drove out early Friday morning, around 6, and headed toward the hills near Llandovery. I'd picked a spot weeks earlier after checking old forestry maps and Google satellite views. It was a wide patch of woods with no nearby farms or homes, and the few trails leading to it hadn't been maintained in years. That's what I liked. If I couldn't see a soul for days, even better. I brought everything I needed: food, water, my old camping gear, and a hunting knife I always carried for safety. No phone reception out there, which was part of the appeal. I reached the edge of the forest around 10, parked at the end of a muddy path near a rusted old cattle gate, and loaded my pack. The weather was perfect, not too hot, just a bit cloudy. After hiking in for about an hour and a half, I found the clearing I'd seen on the map. It was better than I expected. Thick trees all around, a soft bed of moss and pine needles underfoot, and no signs of anyone having been there recently. I set up my tent near a patch of flat ground beside a big tree that had clearly been struck by lightning years ago. Its trunk was blackened and split but still stood. It was the only landmark nearby, and I liked the way it looked, like a warning. I got the tent up, stacked some firewood, and set up a small cooking area with a foldable stove I'd brought. That first night was calm. I cooked a tin of stew, had some tea, and watched the fire until it died down. I slept better than I had in months. The second day was the same kind of peaceful. I walked around a bit, made notes in a little sketchbook I used to track birds and trees, and collected more wood. It rained lightly in the afternoon, but not enough to bother me. That evening, I built a proper fire and sat by it for hours, enjoying the heat and the crackling. I remember thinking I didn't want to leave. Everything felt still, untouched. I didn't hear anything except wind and leaves. But late that night, something felt different. I woke up around 3 in the morning, Not because of a sound, but because of a feeling, like someone had just been standing over me. The air in the tent felt colder, but I wasn't sure if I was dreaming. I lay there listening. No wind.
No rain.
Just silence, and then, slowly, I realized something had changed outside. There was no sound at all, not even insects. I'd never heard the woods that quiet. I sat up, unzipped the tent just enough to look out, and waited. It was hard to see anything in the dark, but I stared at the tree line across the clearing. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 10, 15 minutes. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. Eventually, I zipped the tent up and lay back down, knife in hand. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe it was an animal nearby. I made breakfast, walked further into the woods, and even took a short nap in the afternoon. But the feeling never really left me. That night, it got worse. After I'd finished eating and cleaning up, I sat by the fire again. I had a small bottle of whiskey with me, but I didn't drink much. I wanted to stay sharp. The silence had returned, that same unnatural stillness. Even when the fire crackled, it felt like it wasn't allowed to be loud. Then I saw something. Across the clearing, just beyond the tree line, something moved. Just a flicker, like a leg stepping behind a tree. I froze. I didn't hear footsteps, but the fire popped loudly at that moment, so maybe it masked the sound. I leaned forward, trying not to breathe too loud. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I stared until my eyes hurt, but I couldn't see anything else. I told myself it could have been an animal. Maybe a deer, though they're not common there. Maybe a badger. I stayed by the fire until it burned low, and then I doused it completely just in case. I didn't want to be lit up for someone to see. I climbed into the tent with my knife again and kept the zipper halfway undone so I could peek out. I didn't sleep at all that night. At one point, just before dawn, I heard the soft crunch of something stepping on dry ground. Not far, not right next to me, but close enough. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. Just one step, then another, then nothing. I stayed like that, gripping my knife, eyes wide open, until morning. When it got light enough to see, I got out slowly and walked around the area. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but then I noticed something in the moss across the clearing. Something that hadn't been there before. It was faint, but it looked like a boot print. Just one. Deep in the heel, lighter in the toe. Facing the tree line. Facing me. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone. I packed my things fast. I didn't even cook breakfast. I threw everything into my bag and doused the fire pit again just to be sure. I hiked back quicker than I came in, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't hear anything behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway to the car, I found something else. On the trail, sitting right in the center of the path, was a cigarette butt, still fresh. It was dry, not rained on, not old. I don't smoke. No one I knew had been out there, and there were no signs of camping gear or fires or even other footsteps nearby. Just that one butt placed perfectly. I didn't stop to think. I just moved. By the time I reached my car, I was soaked with sweat even though it was cool out. I slammed the doors shut, locked them, and sat there breathing for a minute before starting the engine. When I pulled out, I checked the mirrors more than I should have. The drive home felt like it took forever. When I got back, I didn't tell anyone about it. Not right away. I just unpacked, cleaned my gear, and sat in silence for a while. I kept going back to that boot print, that sound outside the tent, that cigarette. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. Someone else had been out there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. They didn't approach me. They didn't steal anything. They just watched, moved silently, got close enough to leave signs, but never close enough for me to catch them. I haven't been camping alone since. Even now, years later, when I walk through quiet woods or hear a twig snap, my body goes tense. I think about that silent forest, the boot print, the single, careful step outside my tent. Whoever it was, they were out there for a reason. And I don't think it was just to enjoy nature.